December 1942. The cold breath of Michigan rolled across the flat fields outside Ypsilanti. Under the iron-gray dawn, a sea of steel skeletons shimmered in frost, the vast echoing body of the Willow Run plant. Inside, hammers struck rhythmically, 1,000 beats per minute like the pulse of a nation awakening. Sparks cascaded through the air as aluminum wings took shape beneath the glow of overhead lamps. Above the noise, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and hot metal. Men and women worked shoulder to shoulder. Farmers, teachers, mechanics, mothers. Every few hours, the factory doors opened, and another silver shape rolled out into the snow. A B-24 Liberator bomber, ready for the sky. Half a world away, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto studied naval dispatches aboard the Yamato. His fleet had triumphed across the Pacific, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines. Each report spoke of destruction, but one line buried in an intelligence summary made him pause. American aircraft production exceeds projections. He looked out over the dark ocean, unaware that deep in the heartland of his enemy, Ford's machines were rewriting the tempo of war. The race between destruction and creation had begun. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the world changed in a single morning. The rising sun that gleamed over the Pacific that day heralded an empire at its zenith, a fleet unmatched, a doctrine proven, and a belief that discipline and precision could outpace industrial weight. In those first months, Japan's momentum was unstoppable. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, all fell in rapid succession. The Imperial Navy advanced in a perfect arc across the Pacific, its carriers projecting firepower farther than any fleet in history. Admiral Yamamoto's strategic gamble had succeeded. Cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, seize resource-rich territories, and force Washington into negotiation before America's industry could awaken. For Tokyo's admirals, it was a race against time, but they did not yet realize how uneven that race would be. America's initial response was confusion and shock. Battleships smoldered in the Hawaiian harbor. Thousands of lives were lost. Yet behind the despair, something immense stirred. A nation with near limitless industrial capacity, and a president who understood how to wield it. Franklin D. Roosevelt's words, spoken earlier in December 1940, began to echo across the land once more. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. By 1942, that arsenal was no longer an idea. It was a plan set in motion. Factories across the United States turned from peace to war. Detroit stopped building sedans and began designing tanks. California's aircraft plants multiplied overnight. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts hammered out Liberty ships by the dozens. The American home front became an organism of production, each part connected, each minute counted. But one problem loomed large: speed. America could build ships and trucks, but bombers, the long-range machines capable of reaching deep into enemy territory, required precision on a scale no one had ever achieved. The B-24 Liberator, built by Consolidated Aircraft, was a marvel of engineering, faster, longer-ranged, more heavily armed than the B-17. Yet its production was slow, hand-built by specialized crews. If America wanted to fight an air war over Europe and the Pacific simultaneously, it needed thousands of these machines, not hundreds. That is when the eyes of Washington turned to an unlikely source. Henry Ford, the man who had once revolutionized the automobile, now faced a new challenge: to turn the art of aircraft construction into an assembly line science. Ford's engineers promised something that seemed impossible: a bomber built not by craftsmen, but by conveyor belts. By early 1942, the U.S. government approved Ford's proposal to construct a single, vast plant in southeastern Michigan, one that could mass-produce aircraft as efficiently as cars. The site was chosen just east of Ypsilanti, on a stretch of farmland near a small creek named Willow Run. The scale defied imagination. Over 3.5 million square feet of factory floor, the world's largest enclosed space under one roof. A mile-long assembly line that snaked through the building like a river of steel. Ford's ambition was simple, but audacious: produce one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. In Tokyo, such claims sounded like propaganda. Japan's aircraft industry still relied heavily on manual craftsmanship, with skilled workers assembling planes by hand in smaller factories. Even its great naval victories were achieved through precision training and tactical brilliance, not industrial volume. No one in Japan could yet comprehend the storm forming in America's factories. They could not see the workers pouring into the Midwest by the tens of thousands, nor the night trains carrying raw aluminum engines and wiring toward Willow Run. They could not hear the metallic rhythm that would soon drown out the silence of their victories. By mid-1942, as Japanese forces prepared for the decisive battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, the first sections of Willow Run's vast frame began to rise. Welders worked through the nights, floodlights illuminating their breath in the cold air. The age of industrial war had arrived, and though the Pacific still burned under the rising sun, the fires of the American foundry were only beginning to glow. By the summer of 1942, the Willow Run plant was still a skeleton of girders and concrete, yet its purpose was already legend. Newspapers called it the arsenal of democracy in motion. Photographs showed endless lines of workers in overalls, engineers hunched over blueprints, and Henry Ford himself walking the half-finished floor with a furrowed brow. Ford's philosophy was straightforward, the same that had driven the Model T. Simplify, then multiply. What had once been a farmer's field was now a living symbol of America's industrial transformation. Each rivet, each weld, each bolt was part of a greater weapon: speed. The factory's design was itself a work of warfare. Ford's chief production engineer, Charles Sorensen, known as Cast Iron Charlie, oversaw every detail. He had helped perfect the moving assembly line for automobiles, and now he envisioned it for bombers. Aircraft components would arrive by rail, be shaped and fitted along the line, and emerge as complete bombers at the far end, engines roaring, wings spread, ready to fly. But it was not easy. Aircraft construction demanded precision that automotive manufacturing had never faced. Aluminum sheets had to be exact to a thousandth of an inch. Electrical systems were complex, delicate, and untested in such mass conditions. Ford's early attempts at mechanizing the process met with constant setbacks. Parts didn't fit. Tolerances failed. Engines refused to start. In those first months, the promise of one bomber per hour felt like a distant dream. Yet the momentum of the war would not allow failure. Across the ocean, the Japanese advance was slowing. The stunning victory at Pearl Harbor had given way to attrition. The Coral Sea battle in May 1942 had cost Japan 1 carrier. Midway in June cost them 4. The Imperial Navy had lost the strategic initiative. And though Japan's soldiers continued to fight with ferocity, the tide of the Pacific had begun to turn. But war is not turned by tactics alone. It is sustained by industry. For every carrier Japan lost, the United States built another. For every bomber destroyed in combat, Ford's production line promised 2 more. The American economy had become a weapon no fleet could sink. By late 1942, Willow Run began rolling out its first complete bombers. The early aircraft were imperfect. They leaked oil, their wiring was inconsistent, but they flew. And that mattered more than anything. The workers who built them came from every corner of America. Men too old for combat, women entering heavy industry for the first time, immigrants from Eastern Europe, farmers' sons who had never seen a city. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They slept in hastily built barracks, ate in canteens, and lived under the roar of machinery. They called Willow Run the city within a city. It had its own fire department, hospital, cafeteria. Even an airstrip where completed bombers would lift into the sky straight from the line. Each takeoff was a moment of pride and defiance. For every aircraft that rose into the cold Michigan air, somewhere across the Pacific, an American crew would soon rely on it. Meanwhile, Japan's own industrial base struggled under the weight of war. Its access to raw materials, especially oil, aluminum, and steel, depended on vast sea routes vulnerable to American submarines. Its factories lacked automation, and its production lines relied heavily on skilled hands that took years to train. Even as its pilots fought brilliantly, its machines became harder to replace. The contrast was growing impossible to ignore. In Tokyo, intelligence officers began reporting alarming numbers, estimates that the United States was building thousands of aircraft every month. They dismissed some as exaggeration, others they feared might be true. For every ton of steel Japan could forge, America could forge 10. For every bomber Japan could assemble by hand, Ford could roll out 50 by machine. The Empire of Japan had mastered the art of war, but the United States had mastered the science of production, and that, quietly and relentlessly, would decide the outcome of the Pacific. As the year turned toward 1943, the skies above both oceans filled with new wings. The great industrial gamble of Willow Run was beginning to pay off, one bomber at a time. Inside Willow Run, the spirit of Henry Ford's early century revolution had been reborn under wartime urgency. The moving assembly line, once a symbol of consumer convenience, now became a weapon of national survival. Each section of the factory was timed, measured, and optimized. Subassemblies arrived like clockwork. Fuselage frames, wing sections, engine mounts. Cranes swung overhead, transferring components with mechanical precision. Where once cars had rolled off the line in minutes, now a 4-engine bomber took its place, a machine of 18 tons, composed of 1,000 to 25,000 parts. It was production warfare, not fought with bullets but with blueprints and timing charts. The rhythm of hammers replaced the drumbeat of artillery. Ford engineers tracked every step of the process. Every delay meant fewer planes, fewer missions, fewer lives saved. Sorensen's mantra echoed across the plant. We are fighting a war of minutes. To the outside world, Willow Run was almost mythical. Reporters described it as a city of light and thunder, a factory that never slept. Photographs showed the line stretching into the distance, a metallic horizon of America's willpower. What had begun as an experiment became the template for total industrial mobilization. No longer was the soldier the only instrument of war. The factory itself had become a battlefield, and on that battlefield, Ford was winning. Behind the machinery were people, tens of thousands of them at its peak. Willow Run employed more than 40,000 workers. The labor force was unlike anything Ford had seen before. Women made up nearly a third, their hair tied in scarves beneath welding helmets. They riveted fuselage panels, checked wiring, tested hydraulics. Their hands, steady and resolute, replaced the craftsmen of peacetime with an army of civilians determined to protect their sons, husbands, and brothers overseas. Many workers lived in hastily built housing outside Ypsilanti, long rows of wooden barracks and small apartments known as Willow Village. Buses ran around the clock, carrying shifts in and out of the plant. The night shift called themselves the Midnight Army. It was hard work. The noise was constant, the air thick with fumes. Mistakes could mean disaster. A misaligned rivet, a fuel line crimped too tight. Yet morale ran high. Every finished bomber felt like a personal victory. Workers painted messages on the fuselages. For Tokyo, remember Pearl Harbor. This one's for Jimmy. There were tensions too. Ford's management was rigid, the hours long, the expectations brutal. But the war muted most complaints. Everyone understood the stakes. When the siren sounded and a newly completed B-24 rolled toward the open doors, workers stopped to watch. The bomber would emerge into daylight, engines thundering, rising into the cold Michigan air. Some waved, others simply stared, proud, exhausted, knowing that this machine might soon be over the skies of Europe or the islands of the Pacific. In those moments, Willow Run wasn't just a factory. It was the physical embodiment of hope. The B-24 was more than a symbol. It was a masterpiece of design and a nightmare to build. Conceived by Consolidated Aircraft in the late 1930s, the Liberator was America's long-range bomber, faster and more efficient than its older cousin, the Boeing B-17. Its Davis wing, slender and aerodynamically advanced, gave it a range of over 2,000 miles and a top speed of 290 miles per hour. Could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs and mount 10 50 caliber machine guns, but its complexity made it a challenge. Each aircraft required over 500,000 rivets, precise alignment of hydraulic systems, and flawless fuel integration across multiple tanks. To mass-produce such a machine was a feat no nation had attempted before. The challenge was not just engineering, it was logistics. Ford's team broke the design into modular components. Different plants across the Midwest built separate parts: wings in Michigan, tail assemblies in Ohio, engines in Detroit, all converging at Willow Run for final assembly. This decentralization mirrored the very nature of American power: distributed, cooperative, immense. The results were staggering. By mid-1944, Ford's plant was producing a B-24 every 63 minutes. At full output, more than 8,600 Liberators would roll out of Willow Run, nearly half of all B-24s ever built. They became the backbone of the Allied air offensive, bombing Japanese shipping in the Pacific, striking oil fields in Southeast Asia, and crippling German industry from the skies over Europe. Each one bore the fingerprints of thousands of unseen workers, and each one reminded the world that America's strength lay not only in soldiers or admirals, but in the mastery of machines. By 1943, these three forces, industry, humanity, and technology, had merged into one unstoppable current. But the story of Willow Run was not just about creation. It was about competition, for across the Pacific another empire struggled to keep pace, bound by traditions that could not bend to the scale of modern war. Henry Ford was 79 when Willow Run began production, an age when most men of his stature might have chosen reflection over reinvention. Yet he remained restless, driven by the same obsession that had defined his life: to prove that machinery could solve anything. His worldview was complex, even contradictory. He distrusted centralized government but served it in war. He loathed inefficiency, but found himself mired in it during the plant's early months. At first he believed aircraft could be built exactly like cars: interchangeable parts, fast-moving lines, minimal supervision. Reality humbled him. Charles Sorensen, Ford's hard-nosed lieutenant, became the crucial bridge between vision and execution. Sorensen worked on the floor day and night, adjusting tooling, retraining foremen, and solving engineering puzzles that had no precedent. He was not a pilot nor a soldier, but his decisions affected the skies of half the world. Ford's empire became militarized not through command, but through coordination. His engineers learned to think like strategists. His production chiefs became generals of steel. Each solved problem was a tactical victory. Each aircraft delivered was a campaign won. Roosevelt never visited the plant, but he understood its significance. Behind every successful Allied offensive from the Solomons to Italy stood factories like Willow Run, anonymous, vast, relentless, and Ford, despite all the challenges, had proven his doubters wrong. His gamble on industrial scale had become one of the most decisive contributions to Allied victory. While Willow Run's assembly line thundered day and night, Japan's own production machinery groaned under the weight of exhaustion. The Japanese aircraft industry had achieved brilliance in design and craftsmanship. The Mitsubishi A6M0, their crown jewel, was a triumph of engineering. Light, agile, deadly. But it was also fragile, dependent on fine-tuned craftsmanship and scarce materials. Every Zero was hand-assembled by teams of highly trained workers. Production could not simply be scaled up. Japan lacked access to vast quantities of aluminum and oil. Its factories were spread across islands, vulnerable to air attack and blockade. The empire's industrial philosophy valued perfection over pace, artistry over automation. This worked well in peacetime, but not in total war. By 1943, U.S. intelligence estimated that Japan produced fewer than 1,000 new aircraft per month. America, by contrast, was building over 8,000. For every Japanese plane destroyed, multiple replacements waited on Allied airfields. Even Japan's shipyards faced limits. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines were constructed meticulously, but slowly. Each required months of hand labor. When U.S. submarines began strangling Japan's sea routes, replacement parts became scarce. The empire's strategy had been built on rapid victories and limited attrition, but the United States had chosen a longer path, one of endurance and replacement. For every ton of steel Japan poured into a ship, America poured 10 into factories. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained 5. It was not a battle of courage. Japan had that in abundance. It was a battle of capacity. And that was where the war would be lost. Industrial war blurred moral boundaries. The same ingenuity that had once built comfort now built destruction. In the quiet of the plant's night shift, the line workers sometimes paused to reflect. They were proud of their contribution, but they also knew what their creation meant. The bombers they built would level cities, ignite oil fields, and kill thousands. Yet without them, America's soldiers might never come home. This was the paradox of modern war: salvation through annihilation. Henry Ford himself struggled with that reality. He had once been an outspoken pacifist, critical of the Great War and the profiteering that followed it. But the attack on Pearl Harbor changed his stance. Now his machines would defend the very democracy he had often distrusted. For the United States, the moral justification was clear. This was a war of survival. For Japan, too, it was a war of destiny. But the industrialization of killing introduced something new to human history. War without pause, without exhaustion, without the natural limits of men. Every hour, another bomber. Every day, another squadron. By 1944, the skies themselves had become extensions of the assembly line. And for every Japanese admiral who believed his fleet could outfight the enemy, there was a simple truth waiting in the factories of Michigan. No amount of courage could outpace a nation that had mastered production itself. By the end of 1943, the tempo of the war had changed. American bombers were filling the skies from Europe to the Pacific, and the ships that once carried Japan's empire were now hunted by the very machines rolling out of Willow Run. The question was no longer if America could win, but when Japan would realize it. The turning point was approaching, the moment when the products of Ford's factory would meet the might of the Imperial Navy head-on. By 1944, the rhythm of American industry had become a thunder that could be felt across oceans. The numbers defied comprehension. More than 96,000 aircraft built in a single year. Factories ran in shifts that never ended. Raw materials flowed through rail lines like veins feeding a living giant. And at the heart of that industrial heartbeat stood Willow Run. Inside its vast hangars, the process had reached perfection. Cranes glided silently overhead, carrying engines and fuselages into position. Riveters worked to the steady hum of machinery. Inspectors checked gauges with clockmaker precision. By now, the line could complete one B-24 every 63 minutes. As one bomber rolled out, another took its place. An endless migration of aluminum birds born to fly toward war. Each plane carried a serial number and a soul. They were named Hell's Angels, Tidewater Tilly, the Squaw, Michigan Mauler. They would soon form the vast air armadas that darkened skies over Europe and the Pacific. From the deck of a Japanese carrier, those skies seemed limitless, but they were closing fast. In June 1944, Japan's Imperial Navy prepared for its last great gamble, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Admiral Ozawa's fleet, 9 carriers, 5 battleships and hundreds of aircraft, assembled near the Marianas to challenge the advancing Americans. It was to be Japan's decisive counterstroke, a chance to halt the U.S. invasion and protect the homeland's final defensive perimeter. Yet the Admiralty in Tokyo underestimated what they now faced. They believed the Americans had only a few hundred carrier aircraft in the area. They did not grasp that behind every U.S. task force lay the might of an industrial empire, and the bombers, fighters, and spare parts that poured endlessly from places like Willow Run. When the fleets met on June 19, 1944, the result was not a battle, but a massacre. U.S. radar picked up Japanese formations long before they reached striking distance. American F-6F Hellcats, guided by superior communications and trained through a continuous rotation of pilots, rose to meet them. Within hours, more than 300 Japanese planes were destroyed. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the real story was not just in the sky above the Pacific. It was in the factories thousands of miles away. For every zero that fell into the sea, Japan lost not only a plane but an irreplaceable pilot. For every Hellcat damaged or lost, another waited in storage, another crew ready to take off. The balance of attrition had been broken. At the same time, Ford's bombers joined the growing might of Allied air power. B-24s rolled out of Willow Run and other plants to form the long-range squadrons that struck Japanese supply lines, oil depots, and island airfields. The planes built in Michigan now bombed refineries in Borneo, shipping convoys in the South China Sea, and key military ports throughout the Philippines. Each sortie was a direct extension of the assembly line, a visible projection of American production into the Pacific. Back in Japan, the impact was devastating. Shipyards starved for steel. Aircraft factories ran out of aluminum. Fuel became so scarce that pilot training hours were slashed. By 1945, new aviators entered combat with barely 100 hours of flight time, compared to 600 for their American counterparts. The Imperial Navy could no longer recover from its losses. Meanwhile, the Americans were building faster than ever. In Michigan, Willow Run reached its peak output, 28 bombers a day. The plant's airfield saw Liberators lifting off every hour, their wings flashing in the cold sunlight as they vanished into the clouds. They were bound for the front lines, for the islands of the Central Pacific, for the skies over Okinawa and Iwo Jima. For the relentless march toward Tokyo, every bomber represented a link in a chain of industrial dominance that no admiral could break. The Japanese high command began to see the truth written in reports from the front. America's factories were winning the war. Yamamoto had once warned, years earlier, that Japan could run wild for 6 months before American industry caught up. Now, 2 years later, his prophecy had come to pass, and more. The Willow Run plant, like hundreds of others, had become a weapon as decisive as any battleship. Each rivet, each shift, each worker contributed to a simple, crushing reality. Japan could destroy, but America could replace, and replacement, steady, endless, mechanical, was the true language of victory. The turning point was here, but the climax of this story lay not in the number of planes built. It lay in the moment when the machines of Willow Run reached their full, merciless purpose above Japan's burning cities. By late 1944, the product of Ford's factory floors had become a permanent presence in the Pacific sky. B-24 Liberators, now the workhorses of long-range missions, streamed outward from island airstrips like Saipan, Tinian, and Leyte. What had begun as a theoretical race between Japan's ships and America's machines was now visible every dawn when dozens of silver bombers lifted off, forming formations that reached from horizon to horizon. The bomber crews were young, average age barely 22. Many had grown up in the same Midwestern towns that fed the Willow Run workforce. Some had even watched their aircraft assembled before volunteering. Now they flew them over enemy waters, watching the blue Pacific stretch endlessly below. The B-24's range made it the ideal weapon for the Pacific. It could strike targets more than 1,000 miles away, loiter over convoys, and return with enough fuel to spare. Liberators destroyed oil tankers, cargo ships, and airfields across the Philippines and South China Sea, starving Japan's war machine one sortie at a time. Each mission was part of a pattern, an algorithm of destruction that only industrial warfare could sustain. As one formation returned, another took its place. Repair crews worked through the night, replacing engines, refitting bomb racks, rearming. It was the logic of the factory transposed onto the battlefield. Efficiency, repetition, unending motion. In the final months of 1944, General Douglas MacArthur's forces landed in the Philippines. Japanese resistance was fierce but desperate. Without air cover and fuel, the Imperial Navy could no longer shield its army. The once mighty carriers Zuikaku and Zuiho were reduced to decoys, sacrificial lures sent north to draw away the American fleet. When U.S. carrier aircraft found them near Cape Engano in October, they were overwhelmed. 4 carriers sank in a single day. From the air, the battle seemed one-sided. Hundreds of American planes, many supported by B-24s flying from distant bases, blackened the sky. Below, Japanese ships erupted in flame. The Pacific, once the Empire's domain, had become its graveyard, and still the production lines at home did not stop. While Japan struggled to replace a handful of carriers, Ford's Michigan plant completed its 5,000th bomber. Willow Run's press releases reported a new record. one fully armed aircraft rolling out every 55 minutes. The newsreels called it the bomber-an-hour miracle. No nation in history had ever built so much, so fast. At the same moment, the war's geography shifted north. American bombers, first B-24s and later the massive B-29 superfortresses, began striking directly at Japan's cities. The lessons learned in Willow Run, mass production, modular design, coordinated logistics, were now applied on an even greater scale to Boeing's next-generation bomber. The sky over Tokyo darkened for the first time in 1945. In those raids, the B-24 still played a crucial supporting role, scouting, escorting bombing fuel depots and ports. Each aircraft bore the quiet mark of the Ford plant, its serial plate stamped Willow Run. Thousands of miles away, the factory's hum echoed in every explosion that lit Japan's night. The Japanese response was valiant, but futile. The kamikaze attacks of late 1944 and 1945 symbolized both bravery and despair. Young pilots launched themselves against an industrial wall they could not dent. Every destroyed bomber or carrier plane was replaced within weeks. Every American loss was a line item in a ledger that still ran deep into surplus. For the Japanese admirals, the arithmetic became unbearable. Their reports to Tokyo grew shorter, their optimism gone. "We cannot outbuild them," one officer wrote in December 1944. "Our courage remains, but courage does not manufacture engines." By the spring of 1945, the full weight of that truth descended on Japan. The once mighty fleet was gone, the Air Force reduced to fragments, fuel reserves almost empty, and over the home islands came the steady drone of bombers, thousands at a time. Each aircraft was the visible result of America's decision to turn its economy into a weapon. The skies above Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya became the final arena where Ford's assembly line met Japan's finest military minds. In one sense, it was no longer even a contest. The difference lay in philosophy. One nation waged war through precision and sacrifice, the other through replication and endurance. When the firebombing of Tokyo began in March 1945, it was the ultimate culmination of that philosophy. Entire districts burned in hours. American commanders, looking at reconnaissance photographs, could see the unmistakable outlines of total industrial victory. For the Japanese people, it was devastation. For the Allied planners, it was confirmation. The factories of Detroit and Ypsilanti had proven as decisive as any battlefield victory. Back in Michigan, the end was near. In June 1945, Willow Run produced its final Liberator. Workers gathered as the last bomber rolled toward the runway, engines roaring. They watched it lift into the sky, an emblem of what collective will could achieve. No cheers, no celebration, just silence and exhaustion. They had built a machine that helped end a world war, and in the same moment, half a world away, Japan's surviving admirals stared across an empty sea. The echo of their vanished fleets carried on the wind. The race they had begun in 1941 was over. The empire had run out of ships. America had not yet run out of factories. The war's aftermath would show how deeply those machines had changed history. The bomber was more than a weapon. It was proof that modern conflict belonged not only to generals or pilots, but to the unseen armies of workers and engineers. From now on, every nation would remember what Willow Run had taught the world. Wars are won not merely by courage or strategy, but by production. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, its empire lay in ruins. The grand strategy that had begun with the thunder of carrier aircraft over Pearl Harbor ended beneath the shadow of bombers born in America's heartland. The seas that once carried Japan's conquests were silent. Its cities, Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, stood blackened and broken. What had begun as a war of fleets had ended as a war of factories. The numbers tell the story better than words. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States built over 300,000 aircraft. Japan built fewer than 70,000. For every Japanese plane lost, the U.S. produced 5 replacements. For every ton of warship Japan constructed, America produced 10. By war's end, Willow Run alone had completed 8,685 B-24 Liberators, nearly half of all such bombers ever made. The very concept of industrial scale had become a weapon more powerful than any battleship. Japan's economy, designed for efficiency in peacetime and precision in craft, could not survive total war. The naval blockades and strategic bombing campaigns severed access to oil, iron, and bauxite, the raw materials on which modern warfare depended. The nation that once built the sleek Zero fighter by hand now faced shortages so severe that late war models used wood in place of metal. The Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force by early 1945. The remaining ships were mostly immobile, anchored in bays without fuel. The great battleship Yamato, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, sailed on a suicide mission in April 1945 with just enough fuel for a one-way voyage. It was sunk within hours by hundreds of American carrier planes, many guided by reconnaissance and radar systems, perfected in the same industrial laboratories that had built the B-24s. It was the final symbol of the Empire's collapse, an old vision of warfare swallowed by the new age of mass production. At home, the United States stood transformed. The war had turned the American Midwest into a forge of unstoppable momentum. Willow Run, once a cornfield, had become the largest factory under one roof in the world. Its workforce, men and women of every background, had lived through years of relentless effort, driven by necessity and patriotism. When peace returned, they emerged changed, exhausted, hardened, proud. The government canceled bomber contracts almost overnight. Production lines fell silent. Ford, like other manufacturers, faced the immense challenge of reconversion, turning war plants back to peacetime output. The same conveyor belts that had produced bombers now, prepared to produce automobiles again. But something deeper had shifted. The workers who had once built machines of destruction now demanded machines of prosperity: cars, homes, roads, schools. America's industrial muscle, unleashed for war, became the engine of post-war growth. And in that transformation lay the ultimate irony. The very system that had created instruments of death had now made possible an era of peace and abundance. For Japan, the industrial defeat cut even deeper. The Allied occupation under General Douglas MacArthur dismantled its wartime industries, restructured its economy, and introduced a new constitution that banned offensive war. But American officials, recognizing Japan's engineering genius, encouraged it to rebuild, not for battle but for commerce. The lesson was profound. Japan's post-war miracle would rise from the ashes of its wartime failure. The very principles that had once doomed its military, the emphasis on precision, craft, and quality, became the foundation of its future industrial success. While the Ford Motor Company returned to peacetime business, Japan would spend decades mastering the efficiency it once lacked. Factories in Nagoya and Yokohama would soon rival Detroit in productivity. Toyota's production systems, rooted in lean management and continuous improvement, would one day surpass the methods Ford had pioneered. But in 1945, that future was unimaginable. The streets of Tokyo were filled with rubble and silence. The empire that had sought to dominate the Pacific had been undone not only by superior weapons, but by a simple truth. In modern war, quantity has a quality all its own. And as the smoke cleared, historians and generals alike understood what the war had revealed. The decisive weapon of the Second World War was not a tank, a ship, or even the atomic bomb. It was the factory. In the months after victory, the American public tried to comprehend what had happened. For 4 years, newspapers had carried photographs of bombers rolling from Michigan, Kansas, and California plants. Now those same papers printed images of mushroom clouds and surrender documents. Yet behind both symbols lay the same foundation, the industrial momentum that had begun long before the atomic age. The men and women of Willow Run returned to civilian life with little fanfare. Some went back to farming, others to auto work or housework. Many never saw the bombers they built in action, but they understood that their labor had mattered. The plant's output had filled the skies with the unmistakable drone of Allied dominance. When Ford executives toured the factory after the war's end, they found the immense space strangely quiet. Dust lay on the conveyors. Empty tool racks stood in long rows, like gravestones for an army that had already completed its mission. Yet even in silence, the plant felt alive, as if the echo of machinery still hung in the air. Willow Run's legacy extended far beyond the walls of Ypsilanti. The lessons learned there shaped American industry for generations. Mass production techniques refined under wartime pressure became the blueprint for the post-war automotive boom. The integration of logistics, precision engineering, and labor organization evolved into the template for everything from commercial aviation to modern computing. But it also left questions. The war had proven that technology and industry could achieve almost anything when mobilized. Yet it also showed that progress without restraint could lead to staggering destruction. The industrial war machine that built the Liberator would, within decades, evolve into the Cold War's nuclear arsenal and intercontinental delivery systems. The same efficiencies that rolled out bombers every hour would one day roll out missiles by the thousands. The moral debate that had begun in the shadows of Willow Run, the uneasy marriage between innovation and devastation, would never fully disappear. Still, for those who lived through it, the war's end brought an overwhelming sense of relief and vindication. America had proven that democracy could outproduce dictatorship, that a nation of ordinary citizens, given purpose and coordination, could overwhelm empires built on discipline and hierarchy. The Japanese admirals had sought to control the Pacific through mastery of the sea. Henry Ford's workers had conquered it through mastery of the assembly line. By 1946, the plant was retooled for civilian work. The last remnants of its wartime structure became a testing ground for Ford's post-war vehicles. Then later, a hub for cargo aircraft assembly. In the 1950s, General Motors acquired the site for automotive production. The physical space endured for decades, a living monument to what America had once built when necessity demanded the impossible. Across the Pacific, Japan's recovery began under American supervision. Its factories reopened, its engineers retrained, its economy redirected toward trade and electronics. The nation that once prided itself on handcraft would become the master of automation. In time, Japanese companies would return to global prominence, rivaling and even surpassing their former adversaries in efficiency. A quiet echo of Willow Run's legacy, reborn in peace. Yet the contrast remained unforgettable. In 1942, Japan's admirals believed they could sink America into submission. By 1945, they faced an enemy that could replace every loss before the ink dried on their reports. They never truly grasped that the factories of the American Midwest, the miles of conveyors, the clatter of rivet guns, the endless rail cars of parts, were the real arsenal of victory. The bombs and the battles had only been the visible outcome of an invisible force, the power of organized, mechanized production. The war had been decided long before the final flames reached Tokyo, decided in places like Willow Run, where the hum of machines outlasted the sound of guns. The war was over, but the lesson was permanent, and it led to a deeper reflection, not just about how America won, but what it meant for the world that followed. In the quiet years after 1945, the great machines of Willow Run fell silent. The floodlights dimmed, the line slowed, and the echoes faded into memory. Yet the lesson of that place, of that moment in history, never disappeared. The Second World War had begun as a contest of empires, of admirals and fleets, of courage and strategy. It ended as something different, a demonstration that the outcome of modern war would be decided not only on the battlefield, but in the factory. The Japanese admirals who believed in precision and valor had confronted a force they could neither see nor comprehend, a civilization that could manufacture faster than it could mourn. Ford's factory workers, who had never seen the Pacific, shaped its fate as surely as any admiral at sea. Their contribution was not glamorous. There were no medals for the riveters, no parades for the machinists, but they represented a new kind of soldier, the soldier of production. Their battlefield was measured in hours and quotas, their victories in completed machines. Willow Run was more than a plant. It was a symbol of what happens when a free society channels its ingenuity toward survival. Its bombers, born from the hands of ordinary Americans, became the bridge between the age of craftsmanship and the age of mass mechanization. And when the war was over, the lesson endured. Industry had become destiny. The line between creation and destruction had grown thin, too thin to ever forget. From that paradox rose the modern world, one where technology could both protect and endanger, liberate and annihilate. In the glow of victory, America had learned the price of its own power. For Japan, the defeat was catastrophic but also transformative. From the ruins of its failure came a new philosophy: to build better, not faster, to create value through refinement rather than conquest. Both nations emerged changed, and history would remember that in the Great War of Machines, courage had mattered but production had prevailed. The bombers of Willow Run no longer fly, but their echo remains, in every engine, every factory, and every sky shaped by human hands.